Understanding the dynamic trunking modes is pretty simple. You've got 5 modes. If you've got auto to auto, doesn't work. Auto to desirable does work. Desirable to desirable does work, but it's a little weird to have desirable because then you got 2 desirable. But if you got desirable to the trunk, then it does work. But it's kind of like a manual to a dynamic, and it's confusing. Fact is, dynamic trunking was designed to be simple, but just became insanely complex because of the different modes. So in this nugget, we will explore the various modes of DTP and the purpose of the native VLAN. So I'm going to start us off where we usually are, is somewhere in a network. We've got our 3 sites, Arizona, Nevada, and Florida. And in previous skills, we actually configured Nevada and Florida for VLANs on a single switch. We expanded this site to have VLANs 20, 30, and 40. And just because of where we were, I was like, man, we're going well. Let's get this guy set up as a router on a stick. So in order to do that, we had to configure this guy as a trunk. So you got a sneak peek of what trunk configuration looks like. It's actually pretty simple. But as we dive into Arizona and we configure a full site with multiple switches, there's some stuff that you need to know about. So let's first off start off with a little bit of review. Trunking, what is it? Well, it's essentially allowing you to send multiple VLANs across a single port. Cisco calls it trunking. Every other vendor in the world calls it tagging. Tagged interfaces is what that is, which is a little more accurate because as these devices communicate and it goes across a port configured as a trunk, it's going to stick a little header right on that packet, an 802.1q header to be specific, that tells the other switch which VLAN that packet belongs to. And knowing that it's 802.1q is kind of a big deal. Not just if you're planning to take an exam someday. It's more so because you need to know that's an industry standard. So you can have a Cisco switch connecting to another vendor switch, or a Cisco switch connecting to a wireless access point, or a server, or a phone. There's all kinds of stuff that uses trunking. And if we didn't have an industry standard protocol like 802.1q, we wouldn't be able to do that between multiple vendors anyway, right? So tags are added as you're going across those. They're removed when you get to an exiting access port. So when that packet goes across, it's VLAN 3. Technically, it's a frame. But when that frame goes across and it puts that little tag on the front and is received by the other side, as soon as the other side is like, oh, okay, VLAN 3. So you go out this port, it's going to remove that tag as it exits. If it didn't, the computer would drop it. Computers don't understand trunking. They don't understand tags. They don't understand that little header that's on there. So it'd be like, oh, this must be a bad packet, and it would drop. So it always removes those tags before it leaves. So you need to be really careful which interfaces you configure to be trunk ports. And that's what leads us into the discussion I want to have. There is a right way to configure trunking. Now, Cisco's done some really smart things over the years. And they've done some not so smart things. And in my opinion, one of the things that they did that wasn't very smart is the dynamic trunking protocol. And not their fault. Cisco had all the best intentions in the world. They wanted to make it easy. They wanted it to make it kind of plug and play, where you would have a switch and you plug in another switch and it just figures that out and becomes a trunk port. So you don't have to worry about configuring it. But in so doing, they released a whole bunch of security risks. And that's the problem with the dynamic trunking protocol, is it's the default state on a lot of Cisco switches. So when things plug in, it will start sending out DTP packets. And the default mode of DTP is actually dynamic desirable. You want to see? Hang on, let me show this to you. So first off, I want you to see that I've moved our console cable over to Arizona. I'm in the land of Arizona. It's actually plugged into the back of this switch right here, which is a Catalyst 3550, a little bit older, but still a very valid switch. I'm going to bring up our prompt on that switch. I'll get into privilege mode. And I'm going to do a show running config. Hit the enter key. Now I've configured nothing, virtually nothing on this switch besides a base configuration. And look at that. Every single one of those switch ports is switch port mode dynamic desirable. Switch port mode dynamic mode. It's every single one is dynamic desirable. And what that mode does is send these DTP packets out there. And it's constantly, it's like, I want to be a trunk. I want to be a trunk. I want to be a trunk. Please, listen, can we be, do you get the idea? Desirable. I desire to be a trunk, right? If the other side does not respond, which a computer wouldn't, nor would a server, nor would most other devices in the world, then it'll be like, okay, well, I really wanted to be, but I guess I can't be. So I'll be an access port. And this is where the security ramifications come in, is when it's sending it out, if somebody takes their computer off the wire and puts on another switch, then bam, they've got themselves the trunk port. And that trunk port will then be able to do something. It's actually, technically, if you get into security courses, it's called a VLAN hopping attack. And that's exactly what it sounds like. You, on your switch, can configure different VLANs, so you can literally hop between the different VLANs, which are supposed to be security boundaries, but they're not. So the best practice is to get rid of that DTP. But I'm going to talk to you certification-minded folks. This makes great, easy exam questions to write. What's going to happen when you've got a port configured as X and the other side is Y? Then what happens? And that's where I want to talk you through. And it is actually a valid thing to know. So first off, let's look at the dynamic configuration modes. You have two different options, and let me actually show them to you on the live router so you can see where this comes in. Let me just use an interface that I know I'm not using. I'm going to go into interface fast Ethernet 0/10, and the command is this: switch port mode, and the ones you want to use is access and trunk. Trunk and access. That's the only one you want to use. But the one that's on there by default is dynamic, but look at what I get when I hit a question mark after it. Dynamic auto or dynamic desirable? What's the difference? Well, it's kind of like, I know this is going to sound a little odd, me in high school. Back when I was young, I was really shy. I know that's kind of hard to believe. But when I was in high school, you know, there'd be that girl on the other side of the table. I'd be like, I think she's cute. I hope she notices me. You know, oh, I dropped my book. You know, I'll get it, right? And so I just kind of, I played the game of like, I hope something happens here. And that's what switch port mode auto is. When you think about dynamic auto, what it is it's one side just saying, I sure hope something happens. It's not sending any DTP packets. It's not like, I want to be a trunk, I want to be a trunk, I want to be a trunk. It's just like, I sure hope something, I sure hope she looks my way. And she, the other switch, if it's desirable, is the aggressive one. It's like, I want to be a trunk. And the auto's like, oh, I'm glad you came over. I think you're really cute. Let's be a trunk. And that'll negotiate. But if you got two shy switches, like if this guy's auto on the other side, I know you're like, this is getting really weird. It kind of is. So if you've got two auto switches, they won't form a relationship. You can drop your book all day long, but she's not looking your way because both of them are passive interfaces. They're not sending out these DTP, so it's going to remain an access port. It won't become a trunk, right? So now do you see where I'm saying it's really easy to write exam questions like, what will happen? If one side's auto, the other side's auto, you end up with nothing, right? You got an access port. If one side's desirable, the other side's desirable, you got yourself a trunk. One side's auto, one side's desirable, you got yourself a trunk. Like those all work. But what about the manual configurations? What if I went in on one side and said switch port mode trunk, and on the other side, I left it at switch port mode auto or, switch port mode auto or desirable, then what would happen? Well, if one side is trunk, and here's a little known fact, even though it's a manual configuration, it still sends DTP packets. So if the other side's auto, it's a trunk. If it's desirable, it's a trunk. If it's a trunk, it's a trunk. If it's an access port, then it's not a trunk, and you actually have a broken configuration if that's the case. So a trunk will send out those DTP, but you don't want it to. And this is where I want to get into like go manual or go home. That's what I want you to take away from this. It's not enough. I mean, I guess it is enough. It is enough if you just go switch port mode trunk, switch port mode trunk. That's good. That's fine. But the challenge is they're still going to send those DTP packets. They're still going to try and negotiate. And the little known fact is it takes longer for the port to come up if it's doing the DTP thing than if it wasn't. So if speed is your concern, which it is for most network administrators, go in there and turn on the trunk and then tell it you know what? Don't negotiate. That doesn't say it actually says no negotiate, which in human speak means no DTP. Stop trying to become a trunk and be a trunk if that's what you're configured to be. So let me show you I'll show you the ideal, the perfect world trunk configuration. You're going to come in here and you're going to type in switchport mode. Oh, I just thought of something. Switchport mode trunk, but we're probably going to get an error message. Yeah. That's because I'm doing this on a Catalyst 3550. And this switch is old. So it supports, let me show you. I'm going to come back here. It supports the old ISL protocol. So I'm gonna type in so on really old switches, and you'll want to know this because I know a lot of you have labs. You want to type in switchport trunk encapsulation and look at your options. You've got 802.1q or ISL. So ISL was Cisco's proprietary one, and what it's saying is, hey, you can't turn on the trunking mode until you tell me what encapsulation you're going to use. Newer switches, you don't have to type this command at all. Older switches, you do. So I'll add that in. Okay, now. Back to the best trunking configuration. It's two commands. Switchport mode trunk. You knew that one, right? It's on. It's a trunk. And then here's the other one. Switchport no negotiate. Bam. Done. You've got a trunk. And you've got a trunk that comes up really fast. That's the best way to do trunking. But if you're certification exam minded, you'll want to know what would happen? Like, play the game. If one side's X, the other side's Y, what's it going to become? And be able to pick that from a laundry list. Okay. Last thing I want to talk about in here is the strange and mysterious native VLAN. And this one's one of the toughest things that I have to talk about because it's one of those things that you need to know. So let me just talk about this personally. For me, when I first got into Cisco so many years ago, I got trunking, but the native VLAN was strange and mysterious for literally months, years, because I kind of knew what it was, but I didn't really it didn't really become practical to me. I didn't use it all the time until I really started deploying networks all over the place. And I'm like, that's what that is. So the idea of the native VLAN is really simple. Okay, where would you use that? That's where it's like, okay, there's all kinds of crazy stuff where you could use it. So the idea of the native VLANs is trunk ports should receive traffic with tags, right? We know that. We've got VLAN 10 over here. As VLAN 10 comes in and it goes across that trunk port, it should say, okay, I'm going to put a tag on the front so I know that belongs to VLAN 10. And it comes across and it says, okay, you're on VLAN 10. So trunk ports should have traffic with tags. But what if it doesn't? I mean, what if I have traffic going across to the other side and it gets there and it doesn't have a tag? Then what do I do? And I know where your mind goes, like, well, why would that happen? That's where it gets hard. And I'm like, well, there's all these weird situations. So first off, let me give you the easy ones. This is why that could happen. A switch originates traffic, meaning, for instance, all switches, Cisco switches out of the box, run a protocol known as CDP, the Cisco Discovery Protocol. And that means every 60 seconds, it sends out a multicast message, actually. It says, hello world, I am a switch. I have this iOS version. I have this port number connected to. It's pretty much like an information dump every 60 seconds. It just kind of multicasts this out. It helps us discover the network. Actually, in another skill, I'm going to show you how to build a network diagram based on CDP. So the question is, if it's sending these out every 60 seconds, what VLAN does that go on? And the answer is whatever you configure as the native VLAN. Because it's originate, or let's say you and I access this switch and we're managing it via the console port, right? And we're like that, just like I'm doing on the switch right now. We're like doing our thing, and then all of a sudden we're like, hey, let's telnet or SSH from this switch over to this switch. Okay, what VLAN does that go on? The native VLAN. It's switch originated traffic. That's the one that's the easiest to explain. It's stuff that came from the switch. It's from the switch, not people going through the switch. That'll end up on the native VLAN. And by the way, you can take this one to the bank, write it down. The native VLAN for all switches by default is 1. right? All interfaces, native VLAN will be 1 unless you configure something else. Second thing that you could see where a native VLAN could be useful is pass-through devices. So I'm going to show you this, and this I can tell you why this is hard is because we're going to get into technology that I haven't talked fully about yet, like virtualization and things. That's where a lot of the native VLAN is used. But this one's a pretty easy example. So you've got a switch, right? One of the common things nowadays, as you know, is voice over IP, VoIP, where you've got a phone, right? And what you will actually do in many cases is set up a trunk to the phone. You might be like, well, why would you do that? Well, because phones actually have a built-in switch, because you can plug a computer right into the back of them. So that way you don't have to run a second set of cabling to everybody's cubicle. You can just plug it into the phone and then from the phone kind of daisy chain the computer. Well, in that case, the phone, you need to put on its own VLAN, even though the computer is plugged right into it. You can put it on, we'll just say VLAN 20. So it's not in the same network as the computer because that's a security risk. But then let's just say the computer is sending traffic. You can't really put the computer in a VLAN because it doesn't understand VLAN. So it just sends stuff, right? And it goes through the phone and reaches the computer, the switch. And that at that point, you've got a trunk. The phone will actually tag its own stuff. As the phone communicates, it puts tags on the packet and it goes in here, but the computer doesn't. So the computer comes in, right? Are you kind of following? This is the pass-through devices. It comes in just untagged, and so whatever the native VLAN is for that interface, that's what the computer ends up on. That's the idea of this. And same thing with virtualized servers. You're sending up a server, VMware, Hyper-V, something like that. And all those virtual machines running on there are actually assigned to VLANs. But what about a lot of times the management of that server or a non-virtual machine? Well, a lot of times that'll come in untagged, which is going to be the native VLAN. So the native VLAN, so let me give you the big thing. The big thing that you want to know, because I could go on, there's probably, just off the top of my head, 10 different scenarios I could come up with for where you would use the native VLAN, but some of them get kind of advanced into really hairy VLAN designs. The big thing that you want to know is when you're setting up a trunk, make sure your native VLAN matches. If you keep it at the native VLAN of 1, then you're fine. You're going to match. But if you change it on one side, let's just say you make the native VLAN 10 right there, make sure you change it on the other side. Otherwise, you end up bridging VLANs. You link VLANs together. So it's kind of like that little boundary between VLANs. It's like you tore a little hole in the wall between the two. You don't want to do that. Bad things happen. That's what the idea of the native VLAN is. So let me show you the command. Here's how you set the native VLAN. And again, here, watch this. I'm going to do the command show interface fast Ethernet 0/10, and I'll do that switch port. This is our VLAN dump, right? And right there you can see if this is in access mode, it's going to be on VLAN 1, but it's not because I've configured it as a trunk. If it's in trunk, grab this side there. If it's a trunk, then the native VLAN is going to be VLAN 1. So that's what it is by default. If you want to change that for whatever reason, you could go into global configuration mode, interface, whatever one you want to access, 0/10 in our case, and do switch port trunk native. You see that? And you only have one option, native VLAN, and then you type in whatever VLAN you want it to be. Let's just say VLAN 10. And go back and verify that. And you can see right there, the native mode is now 10, but you want to make sure that you change the other side. All right, so you've now seen the ever-confusing modes of DTP and the purpose of the native VLAN. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.